with the Chinese. Believe it or not, and I'm very glad that tomorrow my colleagues from University of Asia and the Pacific and First Metro are going to be here to satisfy all your questions about the growth rate. But if you have read the Star today, the forecast of the largest investment bank in the Philippines, First Metro, for the second quarter is 8.5% GDP growth. So even if I bring that down to 8% for the whole year, we will be the fastest growing economy in Asia this year. We'll be the outlier. In the same way that Cebu was the outlier during the time of Marcos, we'll be the outlier because, as you very well know, our neighbors are getting into more and more trouble. Thailand is in a technical recession. Indonesia's rupiah is devaluing like anything. And all of our East Asian tigers, who are so dependent on export, are lucky if they grow at 2 to 3%. Now, you may ask, how did this happen? Always it that this economy that used to be called for decades the sick man of Asia suddenly is having its debut in the world market. And very briefly, we will present in detail some of the major factors, but very briefly, I always use the concept of the tipping point that was made popular by a bestseller more than 10 years ago, Malcolm Baldrige. For over 25 years, we have been introducing, slowly, painfully, but surely, certain institutional reforms, and that is the key, institution building. That started with the mother of this present president. The restoration of democratic institutions destroyed by the dictator. In economic terms, during those 6 years, very little happened. I'm being very objective. Ms. Gloria Aquino had a very unlucky team in terms of the economic sector. They were fighting like cats and dogs. But we will be forever grateful to her for restoring democracy, for bringing back the military to the barracks. Then came President Ramos. Just to abbreviate, since there are Indians here, President Ramos was our Manmohan Singh, who in 1991 started market-oriented reforms in India that almost instantly led to 8%, 9% growth over the last 15 years. It's only recently that India has been slowing down. Thanks to, at that time, Finance Minister Manmohan Singh, who is now his Prime Minister. So, President Ramos is the equivalent of Manmohan Singh in India or Deng Xiaoping in China. Liberalization, deregulation, privatization. Then came the actor. You may think, you can forget him. Let's be objective. It was an under era that we finally discarded the inward-looking, capital-intensive, white elephant industrialization that was the rule for almost 20 years. And under the Secretary of Agriculture then, Angara, they finally said, countryside, rural, infrastructure development, farm-to-market roads, irrigation systems. And to her credit, whatever will happen about the accusations against her, and I'm not here to judge, Lord Mabel Arroyo brought that focus on countryside development of previous leaders, including President Marcos. What was his major contribution to our present strength? The Philippines has one of the best balances of energy sources in emerging markets. Thanks to what Marcos and his Minister of Energy, Ronnie Velasco, did, we are now the #2 power of geothermal in the world. We have hydro, we have dendro, and that was not the case in the 70s, when 95% of all of our energy came from petroleum. So these are the changes that have now accumulated. As I said, it took more than a quarter of a century to accumulate, because in a democracy, things happen so slowly. But we are now benefiting from our patience and perseverance. These reforms are irreversible. And so, let me just very quickly present this first, please. So, 7 to 10% possible in the next 10 years. Result of 25 years of slow and painful reforms. And according to Hong Shanghai Bank, that's not me, we will be the 6th largest economy in 2050. Now, some of you who are like me, senior citizens, will tell me, don't talk to me until 2050, I will not be there. But you missed the point. What did Hong Shanghai Bank assume? For us to be number 16 in 2050, starting last year, that was the time, we had to grow at 7 to 9%. So we will see. Those of us who will be around for the next 10 years, we will see the economy growing at 7 to 9% at least. Next, please. That's the Hong Shanghai Bank forecast. Take a look. The Philippines will surpass Indonesia, Australia, Argentina, Egypt, etc., etc. Very powerful economies. Obviously, we will not surpass India, the US, China. They will always be ahead of us. But the ones who will surpass are no weaklings. Next, please. Those are the possible trends. Stable democracy. Improving governance. Let me just elaborate on these. This is the major contribution of this present administration. And you may say, really? What happened to Luneta the other day? My answer is, I have watched South Korea and the Philippines develop over the last 50 years. I'm that old. And I saw South Korea becoming a first world country despite tremendous corruption, as you very well know, in South Korea. As you very well know, presidents of Korea had to go to jail. I'm not encouraging corruption. What I'm suggesting is corruption is not an obstacle to economic development if economic policies are in the right direction. Sooner or later, and one thing I admire in the president is he's in the right direction. And in fact, I would consider this pork barrel issue as an opportunity for him to actually have more quote-unquote victims to send to jail between now and 2016. So I think it's an opportunity. So he has more persons that he can tell us. You know why? And incidentally, this morning, I don't know if you noticed me, I was in the batik. I wore that on the day that there were 100,000 people in Luneta. And many of you are very familiar with what happened in Indonesia. In the first 5 years of President SBY, he did a fantastic job with the help of Sri Mulyani in sending top executives and officials to jail for corruption. And that is why Indonesia got investment grade 2 years ahead of us. Unfortunately, the second term has been very disappointing. Indonesia has been backsliding. And their next election is going to be very, very interesting, because one of the candidates is not exactly the cleanest businessman you can find in Indonesia. If you don't know, you need not know. So I will not mention the name, but I'm sure Rico knows the person very well. So, I am warning President Aquino, if in your second half of your term, you fall into the same trap as Susilo Yudhono, Bambang Yudhono, you are going to be remembered for the wrong things. So you better make sure that between now and 2016, you're able to send a good number of these crooked people to jail. So that's an opportunity. Now, labor peace, I've followed this story very closely. Many of you will remember when the KMU, a leftist union, was very active in the last century. They actually agitated strikes that led into the murder of some personal managers. I still remember some personal managers of Nestle being assassinated. Today, can you think over the last 10 years of any strike that ended in violence? We have that behind us. It's just starting in China. It's just starting in Vietnam. It's just starting in Indonesia. That is a tremendous competitive advantage. We have overcome the radical left in the labor unions. In fact, we're working very closely, as I said to the company, very closely with the labor group. And they tell us it's impossible to organize a labor union in the BPO. There's no way they can convince workers to organize themselves into labor union. The next one you're very familiar with. Right. Then, God's gift to us, we're right smack in the middle of East Asia. And Mr. Singh's advice is very important. Don't forget your neighbors. And I'm not competing with our fashion models, but if you're curious what this strange outfit I'm wearing, it is not a Barong Tagalog. It is called a VIP shirt. It's a combination of the Vietnamese shirt style. You take a look at this. Its imprint is batik. I bought this in Jakarta. And its material is Barong Tagalog, Husi. There's a very entrepreneurial Filipino in Jakarta who thought of importing Barong Tagalog material to Indonesia using batik technology. But I added, because she's selling what is known as batik Barong, I added a third one by having my tailor make it into a Vietnamese shirt. So, VIP, Vietnam, Indonesia, and the Philippines, the three emerging markets that will be leading the ASEAN Economic Community, because they already account for 3/4 of the population. 250 million Indonesia, 100 million each, Vietnam and the Philippines, all with growing and young population. We're seeing a return of a lot of manufacturing enterprises from Japan and Korea because of the problem of very high energy costs in Japan, with practically all the nuclear plants closed down. And the Japanese have very few workers. They have the lowest fertility rate. And to make matters worse, many of their plants in China, from time to time, are being burnt by the Chinese workers when there is a territorial dispute. And that's why the Japanese companies are saying, we have enough of China. We're not the only one they're looking at. Vietnam and Indonesia, and eventually Myanmar. But we still have an edge. And high rate of savings, thanks to our 10 million Filipinos sending $25 billion. Low rate of dependence on petroleum, one of the best performing stock markets in the world. I don't use that as an economic indicator. I'm just presenting it as a positive thing, although the stock market has no correlation with the economy. Every time some people ask me, Dr. Villegas, what do you think will happen in the stock market? I always tell them, never make the mistake of asking an economist about the stock market. You should ask a psychiatrist. And I am not kidding. Depression, euphoria, etc., etc. We cannot analyze. We don't have the tools. And finally, we are one